Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our Pathways to Forensic and Legal Psychology session. My name is Marcus Hanscom. I'm the Director of Graduate Admission here at Roger Williams University. And as you know from the messages that we sent to you, this was not designed to be selling you on what we offer here at Roger Williams. We're offering this session to give you an idea of really what the field is all about, because there's so many students that are interested in forensic psychology in some way, but often have some kind of misunderstandings about what the field actually is. And hopefully we can give you kind of more of an in-depth understanding of what to expect going into the field, what types of jobs there are, what kind of a day in the life is like, and then also get a little deeper into if you're deciding to go to graduate school, which ultimately you'll have to if you want to become a forensic psychologist. We'll talk about the grad school process and what really makes a successful applicant going into the different types of programs. And we'll talk about kind of master's versus doctoral level work and what you'll need to do depending on your interests. If you could, you'll notice there's a questions box. If you're on a desktop computer or a laptop, you'll see there's a questions box on the right, or there's a questions icon on the bottom of your screen if you're on a phone. If you could just type in there maybe where you're from, just so I know you can hear me and coming through clearly, that would be great. I always like these sessions because we have students coming from around the country that join us for these sessions. So hopefully you can hear me, and you can enter in that questions box just kind of your state or where you're calling in from. That would be great, so I can make sure that you can hear everything clearly. Good, so a few of you are posting there. And throughout the session, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer those questions for you. So feel free to enter them in the box there, and I'll do my best to kind of be between my two monitors here with the presentation. Great, we've got students from Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Georgia, Texas, Virginia. So nice mix of students. I always like talking to students from around the country, so that's great. And I appreciate you all taking the time to join us. So let's take a next step and get my PowerPoint working here. So I want to start with the basics. Really, the field of forensic psychology grew out of a clinical discipline, but there was a need because there was a population within the criminal justice system that needed additional support that goes beyond just merely a clinical discipline. And so then there's also intersections with legal and things, and we'll talk more about how legal and forensic really factor in to this work. And it's a largely clinical discipline. However, it's grown into other things like counseling psychology, of course, developmental, school psych, especially with the growth of school violence, unfortunately. Experimental, a lot of students go into those types of work, experimental applied psychology, some social psychology programs, and so on. So there's a lot of different kind of opportunities that you can go into that intersects with the forensic work. So it's not purely a clinical discipline, though a lot of students are really interested in the field because of that work. Really all we're talking about here is, at least at its core, is a clinical discipline that's intersecting with the judicial system in some way, the criminal system in some way. And that could include, largely it's really the specialization of the population. So you're talking about folks that are incarcerated, those who are accused, maybe on trial. You could be working with victims of crime, families of victims, or even those incarcerated, veterans, police. So a lot of different types of populations that really influence. So it's anybody that's kind of connected to the system. And arguably forensic psychologists and even some legal psychologists will work with children in divorce cases because there's a criminal element, or at least a civil element to that within the judicial system. And sometimes children or family members get tied up in really nasty divorce cases. And so there's opportunity for you there as a forensic psychologist to be supporting a child or family member or the husband and wife or spouses in that kind of a proceeding, and having to understand what the laws and regulations and proceedings will go through. So there's a lot of support needs there also. So when we're talking about forensic and legal psych, it's two kind of very different fields. Forensic really deals with largely more one-on-one, more clinical counseling type work, but more criminal side of the work. And then on the legal side, we're largely talking about civil litigation, and we'll get into this a little bit more as far as research later on. But legal also can look at legal process and making sure that there's equity and justice across the legal process. So there's a lot of different work on the legal side as well, depending on what your interests are in. And students coming into forensic psych programs, you don't necessarily have to come from a CJ or a psychology background, although many do. But having a little bit of an understanding, or at least an interest or a passion for criminal justice-like stuff certainly helps. But having some core understanding in psychology, of course, is kind of a general prerequisite, at least to have some courses in psychology. So what isn't forensic psych, and I hope I'm not bursting anyone's bubble, but what you see on TV is really inflating and kind of exaggerating the types of work that you have out in the field. And while some of that portrays some work that a forensic psychologist could do in some ways, the number of jobs that are out there for doing that kind of work is very small. I previously worked at an institution that had a forensic science program, so a little bit different, but had a lot of students coming in that were very interested in CSI and didn't really kind of grasp that work. And even at that time, nobody knew what the BAU was from the FBI. That was something that most people weren't talking about. Nowadays, because the BAU, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, is talked about so regularly in a lot of these shows, of course, Criminal Minds has really popularized that. You know, the BAU is a very specialized part of the FBI. And the folks that go into the BAU, the vast majority of them have law enforcement backgrounds. So when you're talking about profiling and kind of the Criminal Minds stuff that you see on TV, a lot of that is really more policing and law enforcement oriented. And most students will find opportunities going in that direction if they go more into a criminal justice program, and ultimately maybe go to the academy if they're able to for federal level jobs and so on. So a lot of the kind of profiling stuff is really not true forensic psychology. Now, there are graduate programs in the country that are oriented more toward law enforcement-like psychology, and we'll go into some of that, but programs that come to mind, for example, George Washington University in DC, Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia, they're very close, or in DC, and they're very close and connected to federal agencies and have internships and practical work experience and so on. So you can have government-like positions. I always caution students on how much you feel like you're going to be guaranteed a role like a profiler or something. The number of folks that are actually profilers is very small, and the number of students who want to do it is significant. So I always talk to students about making sure that you keep your expectations in line with the reality of what kinds of jobs are really going to be out there for you in the long run. So the majority of students in forensic psychology specifically are not going into federal agencies and becoming profilers. That's not the reality of the work. Forensic psychologists, and I'll get a little bit deeper into the jobs, but are, you know, again, using clinical principles, and they're working in counseling centers, or they're working in prisons, or they're working in the courts. And there's a lot of different intersections of how that work goes. Very, very few are ending up in more of a profiling-like role. And I know a lot of students get interested in this field because of that. But I try to be candid with students up front so that you're not let down the line when it's really hard or nearly impossible to get some of these jobs, especially considering many of these jobs require you to be a law enforcement officer first. And I often talk to psychology students and mention, well, do you want to shoot a gun? Do you want to be able to go to the academy and train and become a police officer? And most of the time they say, well, no, that doesn't really sound interesting to me. So those are kind of prerequisites to getting into that work down the line. And if you ever want to work for the BAU or something more selective like that, you can't just go and work for them. Typically, you'd have to work in the FBI for 10 or more years and really get established, and then have to be selected to get into that. And then the number of people who are actually considered doing profiling work is a very, very small number of that group within the BAU. So some of the things that you'll be doing, we'll start first with forensic psychology. So again, I was talking about how it's very clinical. A lot of forensic psychologists, and largely when we're calling somebody a forensic psychologist, this is typically somebody that's got a doctorate, so a PhD in most cases, although a PsyD is certainly applicable as well, and I'll talk a little bit more on that. But if you're doing things in the courts, if your goal is to actually ever work in the courts, you have to get a doctorate for that work. But what we found is PhDs and PsyDs do fundamentally the same work in the courts. Where we see differences is PhD students in the long run are if they want to run their own research labs and be publishing and maybe teaching and running a lab at a university, those things all require a PhD. But beyond that, PsyD students, it's an applied doctorate if you're not familiar with a PsyD. But functionally in the system, you're able to do the same things as far as assessments. You'll be doing evaluations, trying to determine if somebody's fit to stand trial. If somebody's claiming insanity defense, is that a legitimate defense? Trying to determine somebody's intent to commit crime, and that's often tricky when you have somebody that you're trying for a crime maybe a year or two after something happened, and trying to determine what kind of cognitive challenges they may have had at the time versus how they are presenting now in the courtroom or otherwise. So there's a lot of kind of pieces that you're putting together there. There's plenty of work in more kind of counseling and therapy. Some students go on either at a master's level, like a mental health counselor, or going on to get a doctorate and becoming forensic psychologists, where they're providing therapy to those various populations we talked about before. So some of them may be going into the prisons themselves and working with prisoners and kind of helping with mental health issues there. You might be have somebody that's on parole, or it's eligible for parole, and you'll be trying to determine their fitness for returning to society and determine if they've really kind of successfully rehabilitated. Are they no longer a danger to themselves or to others, so on. So those are things that you might be doing. And then there's other things like therapy for family members or victims of crime. This is very common with sex assault victim advocacy. There's a lot of work in that. You may also be called in to become an expert witness. So you'll be maybe taking the stand and talking about and presenting information about a defendant and about maybe their cognitive circumstances and so on. You'll be doing some interviewing. I mentioned the parole hearings. The least glamorous part of this work is the report writing, but it's something that's necessary. So you will be doing a fair amount of that, because you might be asked to assess a patient, and you're going to have to provide a report to lawyers or to a jury. So those are things that you're going to have to regularly present. That's going to be part of your work. It's the least glamorous, but it's a reality of the work that you'll be doing. On the legal psychology side, many folks go into jury consulting. It's a very lucrative opportunity. So jury consulting involves things like jury selection, trying to mitigate bias in the courtroom. So if you're seating a jury and you've got somebody coming in, say you're being tried for a DUI, and if you have somebody that's a member of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example, that's coming in as somebody that was selected as a potential juror, you might ask somebody if they're a member of MAD, and if they are, you would say that we're not going to seat this person on the jury. So these are all important things that trying to create equity in the courtroom is important. So a lot of legal consultants will be going in and providing focus groups, trying to see community perceptions and community attitudes based on certain crimes. Oftentimes when you hear that a case gets moved, for example, if there's a significant crime and community has heard a lot of pretrial publicity, and there's a lot of research that students can do on pretrial publicity, when all of that gets out into the media and you've now influenced an entire community to believe somebody is guilty, for example, then they may choose to move a case to make sure that there's a more equitable, fair trial. And oftentimes it's a legal consultant or a legal psychologist that is identifying that need to move a trial. But in the consulting side, what's really neat about that is this is oftentimes on civil cases, where say you've got a company that's being sued for $500 million. They obviously don't want to pay out $500 million, so they might pay $1 million to a legal consulting firm, and they'll come in and basically run an entire mock trial. They'll seat a jury, and they'll run the trial through all the various arguments. And oftentimes what legal consultants will be doing is maybe they're sitting in another room on closed circuit television. They're listening to the arguments. They're watching how juries are responding to those arguments. They're watching nonverbals, kind of emotional IQ, and so on, and trying to determine what arguments are going to sit well in court and what won't. And ultimately, when you hear a lot of big class action suits that get settled out of court, oftentimes it's coming from this type of work, where a legal consultant has identified where an argument is going to kill a certain case, and so they'll recommend that they settle, for example. So it's a really interesting type of work, and it's very lucrative because you can be brought in and your expertise is important in that work. Now, on the jury consultant side, you can actually be hired by these firms with a master's degree, so you don't need a doctorate necessarily to work in jury consulting. You also have opportunities across, of course, teaching and government policy. A lot of students will do research in legal psych that might be looking at inequities in the system, particularly when you're talking about race issues and policing, for example. Students will maybe take some of that research to try to influence policy and say, there's clearly a bias against certain types of people. How can we mitigate that bias to make our laws and society a little bit more equitable for all people? One thing I really want to point your attention to on this slide, and it's in yellow to make sure you don't miss it, but I ran this data this last fall on 2018 from Burning Glass. They basically aggregate all of the jobs that are open at any given time, and they kind of bring that together with Bureau of Labor Statistics data and other things. And they found that through 2026, the job market for forensic psychologists is expected to grow close to 12%. That's nearly double the national average for all jobs. So clearly there's a lot of demand. So this is a good time to be considering jobs in forensic psychology because there will be jobs for you in the long run. Excuse me. So this is just some of the categories that you'll be working in broadly within forensic psych. The correctional side is often what many students are interested in doing. Really what would be helpful for you as you're considering your next steps, whether it be in grad school or otherwise, identifying if there are particular populations you want to work with, and that may have to do with the types of crime that committed, or it might have to do with their ages, might be a certain gender. If they're victims, that certainly is one thing. So the more you can kind of hone in on who you want to work with, the easier it will be for you to identify graduate programs or whatever jobs going forward that will fit your interests in the long run. So for example, within correctional psychology, you see that sex offender management is a possible area. We have a sex offender treatment facility north of us in Massachusetts that we have a number of students that have worked at, but it's a very specialized placement, and you have to have an interest in wanting to work with that population, and it's a difficult population. So you may say that's not for me, and that's fine. But when you're selecting programs, you might find programs that have placements with certain types of populations that really intrigue you and give you opportunity for professional growth in the long run. And selecting a program that maybe doesn't have that option may not be as helpful for you. So I mentioned things like counseling of prisoners, reentry programs like in paroling. We talked about substance abuse is very, very needed and important and popular for people to go into now, especially with not only alcoholism, but the abuse of opioids. So there's a lot of students going into that type of work. And then doing assessments, again, assessment of types of crime and certain things. There's a lot of work to be done in juvenile clinical and developmental psychology. Really, that's school psych, school violence. There's a lot of research areas there. There are court-ordered juvenile detention facilities, as I'm sure you're aware. So there's a lot of support needs for the young men and women that are put into these facilities. And it's very specialized work when you're working with, a 12-year-old versus somebody who's 30 or 40 as an adult. There's also family mental health and other things. Education is a great opportunity. There are only 28, I believe, master's programs in forensic psychology in the entire country. There's a lot of interest in the field and growing the field, but there's not a lot of dedicated educational opportunities. So there is more chance for expanding that. So you could certainly teach in the long run if you wanted to do that. Adult psychology, things like police psychology, we look at, you could be doing work that's in policing and helping support police that, they see a lot of awful stuff. This is particularly important at a place like, I used to live in Connecticut, and I was there when Sandy Hook happened in 2014. And you can imagine the type of psychological distress a first responder would be going through after seeing very young children killed at will. So those types of that type of population is very specialized, but needs support as well. And certainly we hope that there's not a lot of people having to go through those types of circumstances, but unfortunately they're growing, especially when we're talking about school violence. So there's a need for that. And finally, things like interpersonal and domestic violence, there's unfortunately plenty of that to go around. So we have a lot of support opportunities in the field for students who want to work with various populations that are victims of domestic violence. Certainly childhood trauma is big. If you're going the legal side, there's things with childhood trauma like memory issues and so on. So there's a lot of different things you can do with this work. So if you think back, if you came in thinking, and I talked to a lot of students or even people that they hear forensic psychology, it sounds like this really jazzy, fun, not necessarily fun, but really interesting field. And then they said, oh, it's like profiling, right? And I tell them obviously that's largely not what the field is. But if you see here some of the opportunities, you can see how much further how much broader that experience can be through forensic psychology beyond what the public views as what forensic psychology really is. Now, switching gears a little bit, if you're interested in legal psychology, I talked a little bit about some of these areas. A lot of legal psychologists on the research side will look at jury decision making. How are juries perceiving certain arguments? How are they perceiving emotion in the courtroom? If you think about prosecutors, lawyers in general, will use emotion to influence the outcome of a trial. Technically, that's illegal. So there's a lot of research being done on how they can, again, mitigate things that are threatening, I should say, threatening the equity of a trial and the fair trial for defendants. There's also work across things like polygraph law and lie detection. There's a lot of research in false confessions, wrongful convictions, looking at eyewitness memory. Many of you are probably familiar with Elizabeth Loftus and her work in repressed memory. There's a lot of research and discussion about that, and especially with work with children and kind of embedding those types of memories that something happened when it really didn't and so on. And I'm really kind of watering that down. But there's a lot of research to be done in these areas, again, to try to truly understand what types of witnesses and types of victims and criminals are being brought into the courtroom, what types of things, how they're processing certain arguments in certain situations, certain emotions, and so on, and hopefully finding ways to really create a much more fair process for all in the courtroom. And of course, that policy piece I talked about a lot. Legal psychologists are often brought in to try to help influence policy in a positive way to, again, mitigate that bias, in the courtroom. And I'll talk about some of the research that kind of covers those areas. So some of the important skills that you're going to need, if you've been to Pennsylvania, you know that photo is a prison down there. I think it's Eastern State Penitentiary, I believe. But through your studies, and I know I'm not telling you anything that's earth-shattering here, but these are really the skills that are true for any psychologist, but particularly for a forensic psychologist. Being able to analyze, understand what might be actually happening, especially when you're talking about somebody who might be a hardened criminal that's done a lot of time and maybe has some significant crime behind them. You might be working with victims, obviously, that have a lot of stress, post-traumatic stress, and other things. So being able to analyze and understand what's going on, being able to think critically, think strategically, come up with creative solutions to problems, being able to communicate effectively. Hopefully you've had opportunities in your undergraduate study to present. Being able to communicate, when you think about going into a court, are you able to communicate effectively your findings about a particular client and how they're presenting in the courtroom and whether they're fit to stand trial and so on? You have to be able to present that information effectively in court. Obviously, detail orientation is very important. Interpersonal skills, being able to observe, emotional IQ, kind of seeing how people are feeling and reacting to certain arguments. Patience is incredibly important, and it sounds basic, but these are all things you should be thinking about. Of course, problem solving as well. So as you're kind of processing all of this, And again, I recognize that some of these questions probably off the bat look basic to you, but they are very important. So that's why we include them here. Ultimately, what is it that you want to do in the future? If you're sitting there and saying, I really want to be in the courtroom, I want to be presenting testimony and doing assessments and understanding people who are on trial, and maybe even in the prisons doing extensive therapy and assessments, those all require a doctorate. So if that's something you really want to do, you're going to have to go into a PhD or a PsyD in the long run. So those are things to consider. If you're interested in doing research, and I mean, an interest is probably it's a lighter word than it should be. If you want to do research, if you're good at research, you've done research in your undergrad, then going in the long term into a PhD will be likely where you end up going if that's what you want to do in the long run. PhD is a very research-heavy degree. So I meet a lot of students who think that the only way to be successful in psychology is to have a PhD. That's not the case, especially when I talk to students that they'll say, I need to get my PhD, and then I'll ask them, do you like research? And they'll go, not really. And if you don't like research, you shouldn't be pursuing a PhD. You can have a very successful career and do a lot of the work that we've talked about with a PsyD or even a master's level credential that's license eligible if that's something you want to do. And we'll get into some of those nuances as well. But if you want to do heavy research and you like it and you've taken good research courses and you've gotten good grades in them and so on, then by all means go into a doctoral program or at least aim for a PhD program in the long run. If you're more of somebody that wants to meet clients one-on-one, and where you're providing more therapy and counseling, that's a more applied degree opportunity. So in the long run, you can do a master's that's license eligible, and in most cases, you have to get a 60 credit master's to do that. Every state's a little bit different, but for the vast majority of them, they require 60 credits at the graduate level to be able to apply for a license, and a license is necessary to see patients one-on-one. So that's a very viable option. And then you can also go into what is a PsyD, which we talked about earlier. It's a psychology doctorate. It's an applied doctorate. It's a little bit shorter than PhD programs, but it's much more applied. It's not heavy into research like a PhD program. So we'll dive a little deeper into the education in just a second. But if your goal is to work in the courts, you really have to set your sights on a PhD or PsyD in the long run. So that's going to help you understand that work. Otherwise, if you want to see patients one-on-one, a license-eligible master's is fine. You can stop there. You can go work, be licensed, and have a really great career doing that work as well if you don't want to get a doctorate in the long run. So just some things to think about. And the last point I say there is in terms of viability of certain fields, again, I don't want to burst anyone's dream if your goal is to become a profiler or go work for the FBI or doing something more law enforcement oriented. However, I just want you to be honest about how few of those jobs are actually out there and how incredibly difficult it is to get those jobs. So if you want to commit to yourself to getting those jobs, by all means, do that. But if not, for the vast majority of students, those aren't necessarily going to be opportunities, at least not early on in your career. So let's talk about education, just so you're thinking about your next steps. If you want forensic psychology, you're going to need, at the very least, a master's degree. And in most cases, you'll need a doctorate, depending on what it is that you want to do. At the master's level, there's two really flavors of master's degrees. You can find Master of Arts programs and Master of Science programs. They're largely the same. However, Master of Science programs typically have an extra class or two in quantitative methods, research, statistics, and so on. So they have a little bit more of a technical focus. They may have a little bit more technical-oriented research and so on. So, but fundamentally, they don't look all that different. And your coursework that you take, regardless if it's MA or MS, if you're going on to a doctoral program later on, they're really looking at your curriculum. They're not as focused on an MA versus an MS. They want to see which courses you've taken and how well you've done. And ultimately, if you're going to a PhD, what types of research that you've completed. Now, I talk to a lot of students that think they're going to go right from undergraduate into a PhD. That for a student, if you're a 3.7, 3.8, 3.9 student and you've got 70th percentile GREs, by all means go and apply for some of those doctoral programs. I would always apply to master's programs as a backup as well. But for the vast majority of students, they're not quite ready, at least the ones that I talk to, are not quite ready for a doctoral program yet. So a master's degree is really a necessary step, especially if your goal is to get a PhD. I'm sure many of you know PhDs in clinical psychology are among the hardest degrees to get into. There are programs that might get 1,000 applications for 5 spots. You can imagine that's a pretty tough, they're tough odds against you. And if you're not presenting a file that has those strong GREs and GPAs, in some cases, many of these doctoral programs, if they've got 1,000 applicants and they've got a handful of faculty, they're not going to read every single application. What they're going to do oftentimes is look through those applications and say, do they meet this criteria for GPA and this criteria for GRE? If they do, they stay in the pile. If they don't even get looked at. And that's unfortunately just the rigor of many of these PhD programs admission processes. Now, they're not all that way, but many of them are. So you have to present very strongly in those numbers before they ever get to anything else. And they can read about how wonderful you are in your personal statement and your resume and all that stuff, but oftentimes they don't even get that far if your GREs or GPA aren't at a certain threshold. So be honest with yourself about where you are academically and what that next step should be so that you can get to the final step, whatever that may be. Now, if you want to go work with patients one-on-one, as I mentioned, you can get a license-eligible master's program. In most states, again, 60 hours are required. Those are typically 48 hours in the classroom, credit hours, and then you're taking 12 credits hours, sometimes more, that are really field work. So you're doing practicum and internship hours. And ironically, so here we're located in Rhode Island, our program is actually based on the licensure in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts requires the 60 credits, 2 years of post-graduate work experience. So in most states, you'll have to work beyond your master's before you can actually get your license, but the 60 credits is necessary. But ironically, here in Rhode Island, they have a longer practicum and internship hour requirement than Massachusetts does. So students who want to stay here in Rhode Island, where we're located, actually have to take an extra year of practicum and internship hours. So most of our students are actually practicing out of state once they graduate. So those are things you have to think about if you're going to get a license eligible program. If you want to be licensed, you have to get a license eligible program. So start there. There are, as I mentioned, about 20, I think it's 28 master's programs in forensic psychology in the country. Out of those, there's less than 10 that have a 60 credit eligible program. And there's only 4 or 5, I believe, that actually have programs called forensic mental health counseling. There are clinical mental health counseling programs with forensic tracks. That's fairly common. Others are just clinical programs where they have some placements in forensic areas, but they don't necessarily have an academic focus on forensic psychology. So those are things to consider when you're selecting programs. If you want a forensic mental health counseling program, you need to find a curriculum that has that work for you. So if you go into a mental health counseling program, you can stop after the master's and go work for a couple of years, get your license, and you're off and running and can have a successful career that way. Typically, master's level clinicians like that are not opening their own practice. They're typically practicing in a group practice. So they're still seeing patients one-on-one, but they might be one of a group of 5 or 6 counselors under one umbrella in a larger office. Whereas if you want to be a forensic psychologist, you would have to have a PhD or PsyD, and doctoral program or students with a doctorate either way can open their own practices. Most commonly, that's with a doctorate. Now, if you go into a license eligible program, you're getting a lot of practical hours. Oftentimes, the work that you do in those programs and or the practicum hours and internship hours can count toward part of your PsyD in some cases. So some PsyDs actually put you a little bit ahead because you've gotten a 60 credit master's degree program. So there's a lot of advantages going into a 60 credit program if you know you don't want to be doing research and you want to be out in the field and want to be license eligible, because you can go to the end of that master's and say, okay, I'm going to go work and I'm going to get my license, and that's fine. Or I can go on and get my PsyD. But if you're thinking about getting a PsyD, going that route, the nice thing is if you go to the end of your master's, some students go, oh boy, I can't take class again for a little while. I need to take a break. So I want to go work. So you have that option to stop, and you have a degree that's very functional because you can go get licensed. If you go into a shorter program, like a 45 or 48 credit program, and there's many of them out there, that program won't make you license eligible. So then you have to go back to school and get more credits. So typically, if you want to go practice right after your master's, you're going to want to have that degree. I see there's a question here. So students with a Master of Arts or a master's degree in general, can they open a practice? Typically not. I don't want to say that it's impossible, but for the vast majority of master's level clinicians, they are not opening their own practice. Usually, if you're going to open your own practice, you do need a doctorate for that work. Now, if you go the applied direction, you're taking, I'll use our program as an example, the master's level in mental health counseling, you're getting 800 hours of practical hours in the field, whereas a student in our master's in forensic and legal psych, which is a research program, they're not getting those hours in the field. So they'll go right through and do research and then go to a PhD and do more research. So they've really not been in the field at all. So often then after you get your PhD, you would go into postdoctoral work that's really you'd be doing a residency essentially under a practicing forensic psychologist. So that would be work that you do in the longer term. So I want to talk quickly about some of the research opportunities first, and I'll talk about practical placements after that. So if you want to select a program, whether it's a PhD doing research in the long run, but if you're doing a master's first, you want to select a master's degree that has really strong research opportunities for you. If you don't have a good research foundation, that's really the goal of a master's. If you're going to get a PhD, you want to build a strong research foundation if you're going that direction. So find programs that offer research. And there's, out of the 28 schools, there's, again, less than 10 that really have high quality, in-depth research opportunities. So you want to make sure you find the right programs. So this gives you just a sense. I'm not going to read every single one of these, but a sense of some students were working with opioid work, procedural justice. These students in the photo were two of our grads who are now in PhD programs. They looked at the violence risk of juveniles in a post-Miller world. Miller was one of a series of cases that dealt with life without parole sentences for juveniles, which ultimately got rid of life without parole sentences for juveniles. So it was an interesting work that they did. That ethnic racial biases in sex offender sentencing research has been really important work that some of our students have focused on, because unfortunately, and I don't know that many of us are surprised by this, it's a sad reality that, for example, men of color, sex offenders, men of color, are treated more harshly in sentencing than white males. And there's a sad reality to all of that work, and there's a lot of research being done to try to, again, reduce that happening in the system. On the legal side, you'll notice a lot of words like attitudes, perceptions, how people are thinking. There's a lot of kind of procedural research on the legal side. So thinking about how jurors are perceiving somebody who is being tried with potential of capital punishment, potential of death penalty at the end of it. And many states, at least up in our area, are not death penalty states. There are many states in the South that are. So you can imagine that there's a different perception of the death penalty up in the Northeast than there is in other parts of the country. So that impacts some of these. I mean, we've had some very heinous crimes that have been committed, and that you talk about pretrial publicity, these get out in the news and people are so fired up and angry about it, and it kind of incites this whole thought of capital punishment for when you have somebody that has such a heinous crime, and it's so obvious that that was committed. So looking at community attitudes, perceptions of pretrial publicity, how do people perceive someone with a disability that comes on the stand, that maybe is a witness or a victim? If you bring a child in the stand, how are juries and people perceiving the credibility of their testimony? So there's a lot of really interesting work that's being done on the legal side, again, to look at process and try to mitigate bias and try to help restore justice and equity for all people in the courtroom. Now, if you go into a practical program, and there's a number of programs that have practical opportunities, some have a little bit of a hybrid of the two, where they have a little bit of research and a little bit of internships. You have to think long term, if you want to get to a PhD or a PsyD, which kind of a master's is going to set you up for those opportunities. If your goal is to go work and say, for example, you want to work for the feds, the feds they don't need you to have a license, and they don't need you to have a doctorate, although many of them do in the long run. So you could go to a 42 or 45 credit program, get some internship experience, and then open some doors and go work for a federal agency, and that would be fine. Otherwise, if you're going into mental health counseling, for example, you might be working in a counseling center or a correctional facility. We have students that work at our local forensic hospital. Those are often court-ordered mental illness patients there. We have some students, as I mentioned, that work with sex offenders. They're under the auspices of a forensic psychologist, and they're able to do interviewing kind of research with those groups. I mentioned juvenile detention centers earlier. There's a number of those, and kind of really, again, you see in these placements, when you're talking about a practical hands-on program that's getting you out into the field, understanding the types of people you want to work with is really going to be helpful in determining which programs you're going to be considering. So for us as an example, if you want to work for the feds, we are not a program that works closely with the feds. We have our faculty take a more traditional forensic psychology focus. So the things that we're talking about here is really what we do, largely except for the federal work. But if you want to go into federal work and work for the FBI, CIA, DOD, whatever those areas of interest are, you'd want to find a program that is aligned with those agencies, that maybe offers internships with them, maybe is close in proximity. So I mentioned Marymount, I mentioned George Washington. University of Denver is a very applied program. William James in Boston, you've got John Jay in New York City, and they're pretty aligned with kind of policing and so on. I see there's a question about focusing on police psychology for internships. That's a great question. We've had some students work in police departments, though it's not as common. I think where students see a lot of this work is in these counseling centers. And counseling center sounds like a very broad category, but a lot of these counseling centers work with specific populations. So, for example, our internships, we have more internships than we have students. But we have, like a counseling center might work specifically, and this is just by way of example, but they might have a population of police officers that utilize their services because they have certain psychologists on staff that are trained to work with police officers. So if you're looking for that kind of work in police psychology, you'd probably want to find a school that's going to at least try to find an internship opportunity that connects you with placements that have those as populations. So counseling centers are very broad, but they often have a specialty where they work with certain populations. So there might be a counseling center that works specifically with substance abuse folks. So they would give you different opportunities if you're interested in substance abuse. If you want to work with juveniles, they might have different opportunities for that. Sex offender treatment, I mentioned, there's a couple of facilities for that. So some students may go into more of a police department setting, but it depends on what kind of psychology you're really focusing on with police psychology. If you're talking about kind of supporting police officers through the work that they're doing, that's one angle. If the other is kind of certain crimes and perception of crimes and other things, there's different agencies and even consulting groups that would be good for that. One of the forensic hospitals, there was a question here, what's the name of the forensic hospital? Eleanor Slater Hospital is here in Rhode Island that we have placed a number of students. I'm not sure of a lot of them outside of our region, but Eleanor Slater is our local hospital. As I'm sure you're all aware, state-run mental hospitals have really been closed in droves over years. And there's been the community perceptions of them have kind of soured, but there's still a need for them. So there are some hospitals where you've got court-ordered patients who need support, and ultimately that's where some forensic psychology students end up, or mental health counselors for that matter. So I want to transition a little bit, and I'm happy to take more questions on the forensic stuff, so feel free to enter them in the box. I want to transition a little bit to your graduate school search and give you some kind of pointers on your next steps. And I know that you're all different kind of class years. Some of you are more looking at grad school more immediately than others. But if you walk away here with one really key message as far as the grad school process, you really need to focus on fit. And that's why, we present a session like this where I don't view it as a problem or I don't feel like I'm competing when I talk about University of Denver or Marymount or John Jay and so on. They're all great programs, but the reality is we've got 28 or so master's programs in forensics like in the country. We all tend to do it a little bit differently. So there's no carbon copy programs. It's not like we can say our program is just like XYZ program. It's unfortunately not that simple, which unfortunately makes your search all that more difficult, because even though you have a small pool, you have to find the right program. So you really need to look at, ultimately, hopefully you've done some soul searching and will continue to determine what types of jobs you want, what populations you want to work with, and so on, so that when you're coming and looking at our programs, you're looking at what courses do we offer, what faculty research do we offer, how are our faculty trained? Are faculty trained as forensic psychologists? Do you want police psychologists? Do you want former federal agents teaching your classes? So you want more some law enforcement oriented? Are you looking for something more clinical? Are you looking more for applied opportunities? Do you want a research lab? All of these things are important questions to ask yourself and also of the schools that you're looking at. If you want, as I mentioned before, if your goal is to get a PhD into research, you want a program, master's or otherwise, that has good research good research opportunities, and ultimately research that you care about. If we can work with, at least in our program, we have a lot of forensic psychologists on our staff, so we have a lot of different research interests across them. So if a student says, I want to work in recidivism, for example, we have a faculty member that specializes in recidivism. So you have to really look at CVs on the faculty websites, on the program websites that you're looking at for each school. Read what they're doing, read about their background, see if there's somebody you can align with. And if you want to do research, you're going to be oftentimes trying to align your application and your interest in the school with that particular faculty member. If your goal is to get internships, become a mental health counselor and get more applied work, you want to make sure that there's good educational outcome or career outcomes for your program. Are they getting great jobs? Are they being placed quickly? Are they sitting around trying to work at Starbucks for a little while and then they're getting a job in the field? So those things are all critical. If you want to get licensed, are you doing the field work that you need? Do you like the field placements that they have? So on. You notice I put location and cost there. I know that they're important considerations for you, but I deliberately put them at the bottom because when you're going to undergrad, at undergrad, you can afford to make a mistake. And I'm not saying any of you made a mistake going wherever you are for school, but there are a lot of people, I'm sure you've met a lot of people that will say they're not using their undergrad major or it really didn't have a bearing on their future career. That's because in undergrad, you're growing into being an adult. You're learning, in some cases, a liberal arts core, and then you're expanding into other areas. But at the master's level, you're really picking a program that is going to chart the course for your next steps. So you need to pick a program that will get you to that job that you want, or the PhD or PsyD that you want. So you really can't afford to make a mistake. And I don't mean this to scare you, but I want you to make the right decision coming to a program, whether it's here or elsewhere. And I hope that, if you choose to go to Palo Alto or you choose to go to Westfield or wherever you pick, you call me in a couple of years and say, thanks so much for that advice. I went to this place and it was the best decision I made. That's the goal that we have. In graduate admission, we're not standing at a table and say, don't go to that university, they're not very good. We're telling you to find the best program for you because we want you to fit well in here too. We want you to be a student who's producing good research and contributing well to the classroom, being part of our community, and being a successful alum. It's not good for you or for us if you come here for a semester and they go, oh, that wasn't really the best decision, and then you leave. It's very hard to transfer as a grad student. You lose credits. There's not a lot of credit transferability. So the best decision, if you can make your decision right up front very strongly in the right program, you'll be all the better for it. And that means educationally, academically, if you're strong or you're certain grade average and aligning well with the program, but also finding something that fits well for you. We know costs are a reality, so certainly you have to ask those questions. But I promise you that if you had a difference of, say, $5,000 between one school or another, if you're in your dream career in 10 years, you're not going to miss that $5,000. You certainly would if you were in a program that didn't open those doors for you because you didn't spend a lot of extra money to go to the place that was right for you. So I'm not saying pick on cost alone, but think about the various factors that I list here in addition to location and cost. And this is a good time location-wise if you're considering moving and trying a different part of the country. It's a good time to do it because most students, I'm not saying everybody, but most students have some flexibility now to think about going somewhere else. They don't necessarily have a family commitment or children and so on. So it's a good time to kind of branch out to see somewhere else. You're not required to stay in the place that you go, but it's good to experience other parts of the country and other schools and so on. So when you're researching programs, it's very easy to go into Google and just type in Forensic Psychology Masters. And sometimes you get some really good reputable sites, and then sometimes you don't. Sometimes there will be brands, even some of the for-profit schools, they create these websites that look like, these really authentic, helpful sites, but then at the bottom you see it's a sponsored by so-and-so university. You just have to be careful. There's a lot of voices out on the web that some are helpful and some are not. The most reputable site that you have at your disposal is the APA, of course, American Psychological Association. And within APA's Division 41, which deals specifically with forensic and legal psychology programs, so it's APLS, so it's ap-ls.org. So if you go there, they have a guide to all of the forensic psychology master's programs and doctoral programs in the country. And it's a completely objective list through them. None of us are paying for any of that stuff. We don't market with them. It's purely a professional listing that they compile each year. Beyond that, you'll see directory sites like gradschools.com, petersons.com. Those are sites that list pretty much all the schools that are out there, and you can search really well based on geography and types of programs and whether you be online or on campus. But there are also paid listings on there. So we have paid listings on gradschools.com, for example. And all that means is that when you look into a program list, you'll see sponsored listings up at the top. They're kind of premier listings at the top. All I encourage you to do is look at the whole list. Don't look at those of us that are just at the top, but look at everybody on that list. So give yourself a really good picture of all the programs out there, and just so you can consider what your options are. And of course, school websites are going to be helpful. And I think the best school websites are the ones that are going to show you where the graduates have gone, doctoral programs, certain jobs, and so on. So what those success rates are, and also highlight the types of research or internships or what their faculty are doing and so on. So really try to dig in to those as best as you can. So I know I'm going a little bit longer on some of this content, so I want to, I'll go relatively quickly through these, but again, if you have questions, I'll stay on as long as you all would like and answer questions that you have. But quickly about the application process, these are the elements that you're going to run into. Of course, an application. Most programs are going to require you to submit GRE scores. The GRE is the Graduate Records Examination. It's basically the SAT for grad school. We'll talk more about that in a minute. You'll also have a purpose statement or a letter of intent, really kind of describing your interest in the program and what you want to do in the future. Letters of recommendation, programs typically require 2 or 3, and there are specific instructions on those, and I'll talk about that. Many research programs will ask for a writing sample, and they're looking for a research sample from undergrad. So for those of you who are maybe juniors or even younger, I know some programs don't require you to do research. If your goal is to get a PhD and do research in the future, absolutely take advantage of any opportunity you have to do research in your undergrad. I know for seniors, if you haven't had that chance yet, it might be a little late, but even in the spring, volunteer in a lab or something if you have the opportunity to do that. But if you can get in on a research project and produce a thesis, or at least do a research proposal in your undergrad, that will really help you coming into research programs, whether it be at the master's or the doctoral level. I know some schools don't require it, but if you can do it, absolutely take advantage of it. Of course, we'll also need your transcripts, and some programs will require you to do an interview. This is more common in some of the mental health counseling programs, and you can do them remotely in many cases and so on. Now, the GRE, which is kind of scary for a lot of students, and we understand that, it is an important part, where schools are requiring it, is an important part of the admission process, yeah, particularly at the doctoral level, as I mentioned earlier. So you really want to study like crazy for these things, do well, and depending on your timeline, you could give yourself enough time that if you need to retake the exam, you can. However, most students that I've seen retake the exam, unless they totally went in cold when they went in the first time and maybe didn't study at all and just kind of woke up and took the test, and then all of a sudden studied like crazy on the second time and got a better score. Most students, when they take it twice or even 3 times, they're not seeing significant changes in their scores one way or the other. You know, it's 10, 20 points here or there. It's not significant in most cases. But you have to make that decision for yourself. I always discourage students from taking it more than you have to, only because it's expensive. It's a lot of toll on stress and being tired, and it's a lot of work to study, especially if you're still in school. The ideal time for GREs, I recommend students, if like toward the end of your junior year, you start kind of dabbling and studying. Once your junior year wraps up, you really hit the books hard and study. If you can take practice tests online, that's the best preparation. So you get a feeling for the timing and the types of questions that are asked of you, and format and so on. There's a lot. The math section, the quantitative section, is typically the hardest for most psychology students. So you really want to study that hard, and that's an important section to most research programs, because they want to know that you have quantitative skills and you can do statistics and methods and so on. And a lot of the math that's on the GRE is high school math, so it's stuff that a lot of us have not studied in a long time. So definitely study and prepare. If you can afford to take a practice test or a practice course, a prep course, I would encourage you to do that. Even on the ETS website, you can spend $49 and get 2 fully scored full exams. So you could actually take the GRE practice test twice and get a full scoring on all of it, so you know exactly where your answers were right or wrong. So that's really helpful, and it's not all that much money. You can also grab a book on Amazon to kind of prepare for some of this, but really become comfortable with it so that you can give yourself the best shot at doing well on the GRE, because it does matter. And in some cases, the GRE score may be a factor in scholarship opportunities, or even assistantships. So if you're hoping to get, you might not want to spend, say, $450 on an online course right now to prep for the GRE, but if it gets you a $10,000 scholarship because you do really well, you probably won't mind that you spent $450 on that. So these are all things. I know it's expensive, I know it's time consuming, but all of these things are important as you're thinking about kind of your next steps in programs. Oh, by the way, before I go forward, master's programs are mostly asking you to take the general GRE. So like the SAT, there's a general version and there's a subject test. So like the SAT 2s, there's a GRE psychology test. Most schools are not asking for that. If they are, it'll specifically say that. Otherwise, if it just says take the GRE, take the regular GRE. And the subject test, you might see. Miller Analogies test is another one you might see. It does have math and verbal and things on it, but it's all written in analogies, as you can imagine. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit more straightforward than some of the GRE stuff can be, but pay attention to what schools are asking for on their specific requirements. When you're writing your personal statement, this is an opportunity for you to tell us a little bit more about you, really about why do you want to select this particular program. If you want to work with a particular faculty member, identify that person. Talk about what you want to contribute to the classroom. Why should we add you to our program? Many of these programs are very competitive, so they're looking at groups of students and then trying to cull them down. We might have 150 applications, and our goal is to get 20 students. So we want to make sure that we're picking those best 20 students. So your letter of intent gives you an opportunity to really shine and kind of tell us really about who you are, why you're in this field, why you want to join our program, what you're going to contribute, interest in research maybe you have, or interest in specific populations and the internship work you want to do. Depends on the program, but really kind of identify that. And most of you are going to apply for multiple programs. Make sure your letter of intent is specific to each school. I know it's a lot of extra work, but don't just copy and paste and just throw a different school name in there. Sometimes students forget to flip the school name. Don't make those mistakes, because little mistakes like that can unfortunately hurt you much more than you want to in the process. Make sure that oftentimes students coming into these fields have been part of the system in some way in the past. I'm not just showing criminals, but they may have been victims of crime, or they've been family members and so on. We recognize that's part of your story. If you're going to talk about any of those things, and many students opt to, don't write a detailed account of what's happened over 2 pages. That's typically been not helpful for students. And don't write a statement that suggests that you want to kind of get back at an attacker or somebody that that hurt somebody or something. We want to see that in all of these programs, that you're going into this program because you want to help people. You want to help the industry. You want to help mitigate bias in the courtroom. You want to help victims avoid or future potential victims of certain crimes, or help victims get through the pain of these challenges. Whatever those things are, you want to make sure you're looking at it in a very optimistic, helpful way, and that's really important to bring that message to the faculty. For letters of recommendation, just make sure you follow instructions. Typically 2 or 3 are required. Oftentimes we will say, schools will say, pick recommenders that are maybe academic. So for example, a research program might say we want all letters to come from faculty. If you're going into a mental health counseling program or a more applied program, they might say an internship supervisor or an employer is suitable for one or both of your letters. So just make sure you follow instructions. It goes without saying, pick people who know you. If you haven't seen somebody in a little while, take them out for coffee, give them your current resume, talk to them about what you've been doing. You really want a good recommendation, because those really short recommendations that don't really say much hurt you a lot more than you'd think. So really get good letters from your faculty and pick the right people to write them for you. Now, when you're thinking about getting into some of these programs, some of us will be able to tell you what a minimum grade might be. Be cautious of that. I mentioned some PhD programs will say, like, we won't accept anybody below this GRE and this GPA, and that's how they start, right? Many programs review more in a portfolio or holistic way, and in that case, we're not necessarily saying if you don't have a 3.0, you can't get in. We're more saying, like, well, you might have a 2.9, but you have maybe a decent GRE, you have fantastic letters of recommendation, you've had some great work experience. So we're looking at the whole package, and most students, most programs, at least at the master's level, are going to be looking at that. But ask questions of folks like me in admissions jobs, or talk to faculty. Ask them what their kind of student is looking for, what the ideal student is that they're looking for. Also be mindful of capacity. There's many of these programs only take a handful of students a year, or like our program takes 10 a year in the forensic and legal program, and up to 20 in our mental health counseling. Programs like Marymount have 80 to 100 students in a year. Denver, I think, is somewhere in the middle of those two, so 50 to 100, I think. So it all depends on, the capacity and competitiveness can all vary by school, so definitely ask those questions. Meet deadlines, it goes without saying, but if a deadline is February 1st, don't apply on February 1st. Apply a month or two at least in advance. Show them that you're committed to their program. You can get your materials in over time. Most programs don't require you to send all of your materials at the same time, so get your application in as soon as you can and then send other materials later on. If there's a deadline, oftentimes they're reviewing an entire pool of candidates at one time and then kind of culling that down, versus a rolling deadline. Rolling deadlines typically mean the programs, not always, but typically are less competitive and they're more flexible with admission requirements. And then if you're admitted, there are commitments later down the line. When you're thinking about costs, oftentimes students will say, I had a student last year that was looking at a very urban campus and said, well, they're $100 less per credit hour than you are. And I'd say, well, but their housing cost is nearly triple what the cost is to live where we are. And the student was like, oh, I didn't even think about looking at that calculation. So I just encourage you to think about all of the costs that'll be required of you when you go into grad school. And that could be relocation stuff. It could be just your housing, could be books. If you need a car, or if you're taking local bus transportation, those things impact your costs. If you have to pay for health insurance, that's another thing. So tuition is not the only number that matters. And of course, financial aid is another piece of that. There are differences between doctoral and master's level study when it comes to financial aid. And a lot of students have heard, and I have students come to me like, isn't grad school paid for? Well, that can be true in some PhD programs, not all of them, but many times PhD programs, if you're at a larger state school, and I know a few of you are, you might have had TAs teaching your freshman level courses. Those are often doctoral students, and in exchange for that, they're getting maybe a 50% or even 100% scholarship, and may get a living stipend. And some students will get the living stipend. That's usually 20 to 25,000 or so, is a pretty common number that we've heard anyhow. And so it helps kind of offset some of your costs for housing and other things. So there's things, so assistantships are common at the doctoral level for sure, and that's teaching or research in those kind of cases. At the master's level, you'll find some assistantships, usually in more research-oriented programs. You'll also find some scholarships, and they're fairly common. Not every school offers them, but you definitely want to look for those opportunities to offset your costs, because we recognize there's certainly an expense with paying for graduate school. So it would really work in your favor to look for places that offer these options. And then the truth of the matter is, for master's students, beyond scholarships or any assistantships that you might be able to find, most students are paying for their master's studies through federal loans. And if you've taken a federal loan before, like a Stafford loan or an unsubsidized or subsidized loan, it's very similar to how those operate, except as a grad student, your parents are no longer part of the FAFSA process. So you actually qualify for more money through the federal government loan. So the direct unsubsidized loan for grad students provides $20,500 a year, and virtually every grad student gets it because it's not need-based. And then beyond that, you can take money in the PLUS loan. You may have taken a parent PLUS loan before. It's now just PLUS loan if you're a grad student, because the parents aren't involved any longer. But the PLUS loan and the direct unsubsidized loan add up to a budget that we use with the total cost of attendance. That's a calculation that includes your tuition, fees, estimated costs for housing, estimated cost for meals, books, and miscellaneous expenses. So you can actually borrow. Most students don't necessarily, but you have the option to borrow up to 100% of the costs that you would need to support yourself while you're in school. So not just your tuition, but things for housing and other things. So you have that money available to you in the federal loan programs. They are low interest. They're currently, the $20,500 is at a just over 6% interest rate now, and it's 7% for the PLUS loan. They have long-term repayment, usually 20 to 25 years. They have income-based repayment. So if you're starting an entry-level job, you would only pay a percentage of your income to pay off your loan. So that's scalable. So a lot of that is really valuable in the long run, because there's some flexibility. And if you go into public service or nonprofits, there is the loan forgiveness program, public service loan forgiveness program. We're not sure what the future of that looks like. There's a lot of political infighting about it, but that is available if you go into a nonprofit type work, which some psychology students will ultimately do. So you have a lot of financial support for you. The primary difference is, if you go and look for private loans, you might be able to find, in rare cases, a private loan that has a good competitive interest rate, but you have to pay it back within 5 or 10 years. So that's, even though you have a better interest rate, you're forced to pay a higher amount of money very soon and get that paid off, whereas the federal loans give you a longer horizon to kind of pay that back. So I see there's a few questions, so I'm going to get to them in just a second related to the program. So hang tight just 1 second. One other final kind of consideration is related to your life outside the classroom. So when you're thinking about fit, do you want to be in a city? you want to be somewhere that's quieter? This is our campus on the right there. If you like the water, we're a pretty nice spot. So you might want to find a place that you don't need a car. Do you want to live like in a city like DC or New York or Boston that has a very good public transportation system? Or do you want to have your car and be able to have the freedom to kind of go wherever you want? So all those things kind of factor into your decision. Do you want to live on campus? I mean, most campuses don't have graduate housing. Some of the more public institutions have grad housing. There's not a lot in the smaller private schools. But many grad students like living off campus anyway. It's often cheaper because housing on campus is usually fairly expensive. So there's a lot of apartments and things off campus. Do you want to work while you're in school? Do you want to have a proximity to places that you can work? Those things. Do you want to engage with the campus? If so, you might want to find a place that has organizations that provide activities. We have a graduate student association. Here, we're actually going to a Broadway show, traveling Broadway show in Providence on Friday night. We've done some happy hours. We're going to be going to the Red Sox in the spring and Blue Man Group. And so we do some social stuff, but also, opportunities to network and professional sessions like resume workshops and so on. So if those are important to you, you might want to find campuses that have those. Others have bigger kind of campus-wide events. Plus, if you're going to be doing a program that has internships, and say you don't have transportation, do you find a campus that's close that you can access internships without needing a car? Or if you're going to have a car, what types of opportunities do you want within driving distance? So I'm going to tell you really quickly about our two programs if you're interested in them. And then I'm going to answer the questions that you have. If you have any other questions about the field, about the fit stuff in the grad school process, please enter them in the box and I'll get to them in just a second. So real quickly, just about Roger Williams. We're a small private institution in Bristol, Rhode Island. You saw a picture of campus on the last slide. It's a beautiful spot right on the water. We have two programs that kind of hit both sides of what we were talking about. So we have a 45 credit, they're both 2-year programs, but a 45 credit program that's for research students who want to get into a PhD program. The goal is to get students graduated and into PhDs from that. And they do an extensive research thesis. So you're doing research the entire 2 years that you're here, including a directed research project with faculty in your first year, and then your thesis. Then we also have the 60 credit mental health counseling, forensic mental health counseling program with extensive field work. You've got 200 hours in practicum and 600 hours in internship. You do go over the summer with that program. We are one of the 5 or so programs that are forensic mental health counseling in the U.S. Students have gone on to a variety of doctoral programs, top programs around the U.S., but also in Canada and in Europe. You may know that PhDs in forensic psychology don't exist in the United States. The United States has programs like PhD in clinical with a track in forensic or a lab or research track, or a PhD in applied or clinical or social or experimental psych with a forensic track. So those are common in the United States. If you want PhDs in forensic, those are offered abroad. So we have a couple of students that have done that at Carleton, for example, in Canada. We've had a few going to Europe and so on. But these are some of the other programs, PhD programs, also PsyDs for some of the forensic mental health counseling students. Again, they get some credit for the work that they did in the FMHC program, so that helps. And some of the careers you see, they're kind of all over, largely in this area because most of them get hired from their internship placement. So that's one of the beauties of getting a lot of good hours. If you're in a good placement and you do well, you can get hired. So our job placement is close to 100% for students that are going into more field work. One particular student that we're really proud of actually came from Michigan. I know a few of you are from Michigan. She graduated from Albion College, small liberal arts school in central Michigan, or I should say South Central Michigan. Her name is Rebecca Snyder, and she was a 2016 graduate of our forensic and legal program. She, if you're all familiar with the Larry Nassar case at Michigan State, she was the sex assault victim advocate for the 156 women that were part of that case. So very high profile case, I'm sure, as you heard, and she supported all of the women through their testimony in that case. So it's really, really difficult case, but we're proud of the work that she's done representing our program and certainly helping the field. We also had, this is just a group of students that last year were invited to present a symposium, which is really kind of unique and rare for students. This was at the Eastern Psychological Association conference in Philadelphia. These are all first-year students you see in the photo. And that's one thing we pride ourselves on. If you're interested in getting a PhD or doing research, we try to get our first-year students doing research right off the bat so that you can present at conferences your first year and ultimately meet PhD faculty and network before you're going into the application process. Many of these conferences are in the spring, and so you don't want to miss the application process. And if you're presenting in your second year, you've already been applying to PhD programs by the time you're presenting. So we try to get students out in front of faculty that first year. As a thank you for your coming tonight, if you decide that you want to apply to our programs, you can use the fee waiver code that you see on the screen, so GRCWFP358. So write that down if you're interested. It'll save you $50 off the application fee, which is hopefully a nice deal for you if you decide to apply to either one of our programs. And that does it for me as far as my content. Now I'm going to answer any questions that you have, and I know there's a series of questions here, so please bear with me as I get through the list. And if you have other questions, please ask them, and I'll be happy to answer them and stay on as long as you'd like. And I appreciate that everyone has stayed on a little bit longer than we anticipated, but hopefully this is helpful information. So I see there's a question here related to forensic and criminal photography, and are there any minors at Roger? Typically, you don't see minors in graduate programs. You often see concentrations or even graduate certificates. We don't offer those in our forensic programs here. There are a couple programs, I think, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but if you look at the APLS guide, there are a few programs that offer concentrations or certificates as part of them. I believe Marymount has a criminal track. They also have a joint degree program between their forensic program and the mental health counseling program at 75 credits, so it's a little bit longer to do that, but they have those options there. For forensic photography, boy, that's very specialized. So you might actually want to look more into photography specialization. So you might be looking at a degree in photography. Or I know that there are some forensic science programs, and I'm thinking to my alma mater, University of New Haven in Connecticut, but there are others that do more crime scene investigation work. And if you're interested in that, I would suggest looking at I think the program at New Haven is called an MS in Investigations, I believe, and it's at least partially online, if I'm not mistaken. And that program will give you some crime scene stuff. The photography is definitely part of that. I know the forensic science students did a lot of photography there as well, and photography, they're photographing evidence and blood splatter and bodies and all that kind of stuff. So if that's something you're interested in, forensic psychology may be a place to look. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences, AAFS, is the national organization dedicated to that, and they have an accrediting body called FEPAC, and you might be able to look at programs there that show forensic science programs. The trouble with forensic science is very science-oriented, so it's biology or chemistry most commonly. And if you're not a science student, if you're not inclined to do science, then that wouldn't be a good fit program for you. So you'd probably be better off in a criminal justice program with some photography opportunity if they do CSI work, or an investigations or crime scene investigation like program that gives you opportunities to photograph at mock crime scenes and so on, or go to a place that has a body farm, for example. Is it possible to take classes online to start and then move to campus later on when needed for a practicum or experience with the program? So our program does not, but there are some online programs out there. I can't speak to their entire requirements, although I know there are models for online programs where, like mental health counseling, you're doing your coursework online, and then for your practicum hours, you don't necessarily relocate to the campus, but you would have a supervised experience close to where you live. So some programs are set up that way where you can get a supervisor at a local clinical placement, and that would count for your hours going back to your program that's effectively online in another state. but you're actually doing your clinical hours close to home. So it actually works out pretty well. I'm not aware of any setups that are online and then you go to campus later on. There are some limited residency programs in certain disciplines. I don't know that there are any in forensic psych, but limited residency programs would be online largely, and then you might go a weekend a month or a few weekends a semester or something. But that's less common in these programs. As you can imagine, with counseling or psychology, there's a lot more work in person with folks. So definitely look at those models. Every school is a little bit different, but you might find something that works. There's a question here about assistantships. What are the requirements to receive an assistantship, and what are the benefits of having an assistantship? And make sure if you have more questions, this is the end of the list right now. If you have more questions, feel free to put them in the box there while we're answering. For an assistantship, every school is a little bit different, but typically it depends on what type of assistantship they're offering. Usually there are 3 different types of assistantships that I'm aware of. There's administrative assistantships where you're basically working in an office on campus, and assistantships often have a kind of paid hourly work component, so you're basically getting a paycheck for a certain number of hours, and they often have kind of a scholarly academic component that might be a quarter tuition scholarship or a half tuition scholarship. So assistantships usually have a little bit of both, but not always. But that's usually a benefit of them. The administrative ones typically, you might be in office, like we have administrative assistants in here in graduate admission. We actually have from William James, we have PsyD students that are doing they're doing practicum work over in our counseling office here on campus. We have research assistants, and research assistants are very common in doctoral programs or in research master's programs. Those research assistants are often supporting research projects with faculty, or in some cases they're teaching assistants, which are common with PhD programs in particular. We have some TAs here in our research program, though we don't have TAs teaching classes. If you're going to, a larger state school, they often have TAs teaching classes, and usually the TAs are doctoral students. The master's TAs here are more mentoring undergraduate students in labs and supporting faculty that are teaching. So assistantships are really great. I mean, the scholarships on their own are good because it's just free money. So a scholarship is different from an assistantship in that you're just getting money off your tuition in most cases. Whereas an assistantship is you're doing something for the campus in exchange for some financial support for your program. So that's really what an assistantship is doing, but they're just in different flavors. In some cases, like if any of you were RAs in your undergraduate studies, you might want to become a resident director, an RD. Some campuses will have grad students BRDs, and they're basically getting their tuition and housing for free, and sometimes get a food stipend in exchange for their work as an RD, which is, if any of you have done that kind of work, it's more than a full-time job, so it's not like it's easy free money, but that's a great way to offset your costs. Some athletic programs offer assistantships, so if you're a college athlete, you might be able to go to a campus that has teams that hire assistant coaches that are grad students. And so you'd be getting some assistantship support that way. But again, every campus is a little bit different. But the assistantships are really great, and they let you build your resume. I mean, we have one of our students is a actually 2 of them in our forensic program are research assistants, but with the institutional research office on campus. So that's an administrative office that supports our federal reporting, any of our data needs on campus. Anytime we're producing any statistics about the campus and our students, that all comes from that office. And we have 2 grad students that work in there as their assistantships. So they're getting, in that placement, they actually get more money through the payroll than they do a scholarship because they do more hours of work, including in the summer. But then they also get some scholarship as well. But these students, what we found is they've been given opportunities to present at national research conferences for institutional research. So though that's not forensic oriented, they're very statistics minded, or they did really well on the quant, for example, on GRE. and they were able to get these positions that paid very well, and now got a research experience or presentation experience at a national conference. And in some cases, they've gone into that work. So it's really opened up some other career doors. So your assistantship often is related to your program, but if it's not, you can be getting all sorts of other skills in a different area, and you're just building your resume. And whether you choose to go that direction in the future or not, you're going to have a really nice foundation of skills in other areas. So what's a good next step for freshman and sophomore undergrad students who want to apply for grad school in the future? That's a great question. And it's great that you're researching this early. I think first you really, and given that it's early in your academic career, you may not have had enough time to truly explore kind of your interests. So take advantage of electives and course offerings that allow you to dabble in different areas. Like if you think forensic psychology is something you want to do, and you have the option of taking, say, a criminal justice elective, if you're in a psych program, for example, take advantage of that. If you can talk to your faculty about opportunities to do research, if you think that's something you're going to do, and especially if you're freshman or sophomore level, you might not be doing too much heavy research that early in your academic career. But if you're thinking about it that early, you can start talking to faculty that might be able to help you get those opportunities, and allow you to dabble in maybe not a formal research project, but at least help some research projects. And then it would at least give you a taste of what that work is like. And you might say, yeah, I really love this. And you would continue and do a more comprehensive research project. Or you might say, oh, this was nice to try, but I don't want to do it. And so I think the earlier in your academic career that you can start dabbling in different things to allow you to explore those interests, the better you'll be. Because then come, sophomore into junior year, you're now able to really have a deeper sense on what it is that you want, and you can start really researching. Hopefully you're researching schools through your sophomore, junior year anyhow. But then maybe come the summer after your sophomore year, or early part of your junior year, maybe you're starting to visit schools. Maybe you've talked to folks that are working at admissions, asked questions of us and so on. Really visiting a campus is one of the best things you can do. And some campuses even offer visit grants. Like we offer visit grants for students. So if you come out and visit us before you're admitted or before you enroll, and you ultimately enroll, you'll get a $500 credit on your bill in the fall. So you save a little bit of money that way. So it's kind of an acknowledgement and savings for you making the trip out. But there's really very little substitute for that, because you can actually meet the faculty, meet the students, sit in on a lunch, sit in on a class, and really get a sense of what that experience is like. And there's a lot that just stepping onto a campus can tell you in your gut on whether it's a place that you'd want to be or not. And if you can't get that feeling, it's really hard to make that decision. I had a student a few years ago that came from Mississippi. She had never stepped foot on campus. She had hardly talked to any of us going through the admission process. And the first time she came to campus was for the first day of class. And she stayed, a couple of months, but Mississippi and Rhode Island are very different places, as you can imagine. So she had never really gotten a sense for that. And had she traveled to campus and maybe seen the area a little bit and decided if this felt comfortable to her or not, maybe she would have been able to avoid that decision for her, because ultimately it cost her money and she lost time because she was in the program that wasn't the best fit for her. And we know that, if a student wants to be maybe used to being at home or commuting from their, saving money with their folks, or maybe they want to be in a bigger place where they're in a lecture hall style class and they're not a name and a face. I mean, that's all fine. We're not judging any of that, but they may or may not be the best fit for the campus that we offer here or the program that we offer here. So that's why fit is so important, and why we're not going to tell you, well, don't go to Marymount. I mean, we're not here to compete. We're here to get you to the best place that will get you ultimately to the best career and PhD. So definitely do your research. It was a long answer, but I hope that was helpful for you. And you've got the benefit of time. Definitely study ahead of time for the GREs if you know you're applying for programs that need GREs. Keep your grades up. Your grades absolutely will matter. It's easy to get kind of drawn into the freshman sophomore year, especially into the party and social stuff, and we get all that, but unfortunately it comes back to bite a lot of students by the time junior year, senior year comes around and they're applying to grad school, because in some competitive programs, most of them, it's not going to be enough to just say, oh well, I just kind of had a fun freshman year, but I really straightened myself out after that. That's not going to work in a lot of the competitive programs. Certainly won't work in PhDs. So you really want to keep your grades up and do well, and ultimately that can open up doors for assistantships and scholarships. And I know for everybody, money is really something important. So that would behoove you to kind of keep those up. Some good resources for studying for the GRE. ETS.org, so Educational Testing Service, is the administrator of the GRE. They have the official resources on their site, so I would start there. They have some great resources for practice questions. They have a few practice tests that you can download at no cost, but they don't score them. And then I mentioned earlier the kind of low end, or at least lowest cost option to you, which I think is really worthwhile, is for $49 you can get 2 fully scored practice tests. So basically you take the test twice. They're different, but you take it twice, and each one is fully scored, so you know exactly what questions you got wrong and why, and they have explanations and all of that. So that's a really helpful resource. The most effective prep, I think, largely is if you can take a prep course. They can be expensive. I think the one that is advertised on their site is around $1,000. Most students don't want to pay that. I understand that. Again, if you do really well and it gets you scholarships in the long run, that's kind of a wash. But that might be a little expensive for most folks. There's an online course that they do for $450 or $495, something like that, right around $500. That's probably your best option for a course from a financial standpoint. It is still a little expensive, but it's a good option. I would say for everybody, really the best bet, at the very least, is to get a practice book on Amazon or something and get that $49 practice test. What you can do too is there's a lot of other practice tests around the web. Even just take those, dabble with them, get used to the questions. Really half the battle with the GRE is understanding and kind of keeping your stress down about the timing and the stress of the exam itself, and the other half is the content. So if you can really take a lot of practice tests and those practice questions and feel really comfortable in the timing, and you don't have to read instructions because you know what types of format questions are coming, all of that will alleviate a lot of your stress once you come to the exam. So I would take as many practice tests as you can. That's the best resource that you have available to you. And given that you have time on your side, if you're starting earlier, you could try to take the GRE as early as junior year. Your GRE scores are good for 5 years. So if you take them junior year, that's fine. It also gives you the opportunity to take them again if you wanted to, but as I mentioned, you may not see a significant difference between one score and another. So just do what's best for you there. And, especially with time on your side, you should do really well and not feel too stressed about the exam because you have some time to prepare for all that. But there's a lot of resources online. ETS is the definitive place because they are the ones who run the exam, but definitely take practice tests. And as I mentioned, there's 3 sections on the GRE. So there's the verbal, there's like analogies and grammar type stuff and so on. And then there's the quantitative section, which is all math and statistics type stuff. And then there's a writing section, which is open form. You're writing an essay. And the students in psychology typically do well on the verbal and the writing. It's quant that they struggle with. And as I mentioned, the research programs want to see that you do well on quant. So it's trigonometry, it's geometry, it's calculus. Most students haven't taken it in a long time. So definitely brush up on your math skills. That's really going to help you in the long run and get you into good programs. PhDs are going to care a lot about GREs, and the master's programs, particularly the research programs, are going to care a lot about them as well. So doing well will really set you up for long-term success on that. So I know we've gone quite a bit over and we've lost a few students at this point, but are there any other questions that I can answer? Again, I'm happy to stay on as long as you have questions here. And I'm also available to be a resource for you at any point in the future, whether it's Roger Williams related or not. So if you have questions again about GRE, grad school process, I mean, if you're writing a personal statement for another school, by all means, I'm happy to look it over for you, and if you want some feedback. So that's my direct phone line and my email address on the screen. So feel free to use that if I can help at all. I hope this was a really helpful session for you. I appreciate those of you sticking it out for this long. I know we're pushing an hour and a half at this point, but I hope that was helpful for you, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. So thanks again. Happy holidays. Best of luck with finals if you're in school. Enjoy your break, and I hope to hear from you soon. So take care.